Hello, good afternoon, Groundswell. Hello, Elizabeth. Very nice to see you. So I had the idea for this. I was trying to work out why so many of us had spent so long trying to fix the food system. And I had seen up front the work of many people in this room, and actually the two people on the stage, who I believe both generally wanted to fix the food system. And yet we are still in a situation where nature in this country is declining. The government's statutory target is to reverse the decline by 2030, so it's going to continue to decline for 5 years. We're in a situation where we're missing our climate targets, where agriculture, which is currently 12 to 14% of the total UK climate emissions, is projected within DEFRA. I think it's up to 50% by 2035, 2040. It's the only sector that's not coming down, and we're in a country where the food we eat is the biggest cause of avoidable ill health by far from any other cause. And in fact, I was called back into Treasury by the last administration, by Jeremy Hunt's Treasury, because they believe that 2.8 million people who are permanently out of work, a large part of the reason that they're out of work is to do with diet. There are 4 diseases that are the main cause: that, musculoskeletal problems, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular problems, and mental health. And 3 of those are caused by diet, and 1 of them is exacerbated by diet. So, but on any measure, our food system is in a mess. But it is also, as I said in the food strategy, a miracle in some ways. We have an availability and abundance of food that would be unimaginable to our great-grandparents at a cost which means that for many people, things that would have been luxuries 50 years ago are now widely available. And if you were to cut off nitrogen fertilizer now, overnight, you would stop feeding probably 40 or 50% of people in the country. So the question, in the world. So the question is, how do we get from this miracle that is also a disaster through to a better system? And why, given that these people here and a lot of people here have tried to do this, have we failed? And that's what I want to try and examine today. So can we examine why it's been so difficult and how we could wish our successors, in your case, George, and in your case, Justin, more success and give them some tips. I'm joined today by George Eustice, Secretary of State at the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, also before that a minister, probably the longest serving politician ever in the department, is my guess. He was, I served under 5 Secretaries of State while I was there, and there's a prize to anyone who can name all of them. But certainly...
including George.
Including George. But certainly Michael Gove and George were the 2 by far the most dedicated to this cause and by far the most competent, and I saw the battles that they faced trying to land actually on a very narrow landing strip between farmers, the NGOs, agriculture, and so fantastic. George now runs Prenbrose Consulting, which works with agriculture and food, helping people navigate problems in the food system. Fantastic to have George Eustice here today. Give him a clap. And we also have Justin King, who was former CEO of Sainsbury, who did a lot there to take pesticides out of food, had a big campaign on that. He was on my advisory panel when I did the National Food Strategy, and he was one of the most enjoyable pain in the arses. That's probably a slightly wrong phrase, but he was. I'll scratch that for the record for the podcast. He was one of those irritating people who had a habit of being right about things you didn't want to believe were true. So we all have things that we don't want to believe are true, and Justin and actually Tim Lernig were the 2 people I advised panel who were irritatingly forthright about telling you why what you wanted to be true wasn't actually true, and a very, very good systems thinker. So very good to have Justin King on the panel today.
Thank you.
I'm here, by the way, now not under the Eustice Food Strategy. I'm here as part of Bramble Partners, which we try and advise and invest in sustainable food systems. And our motto, thanks to Izzy and Charlie, is the thorn is the mother of the oak. So complexity and difficulty create great things. I'm going to start by asking first you, George, and then you, Justin. I think it's undeniable that the food system today is not regenerating nature. It's a mining practice, and that it is causing us harm, and clearly none of us want that. If you were to look forward 20 years and to think about what a really good, healthy food system could look like, how would you describe that?
I think for me, the key thing is that we would have learned as a country to recognize the lessons of the past. And so when we talk about regenerative agriculture, a lot of it is really a rediscovery of the lost art of farming and soil husbandry and fusing it with the best technology we have today. So I think what we would do is almost rewind to that post-war agricultural revolution, but reboot it in a different direction, in a way that supports nature, that supports financial resilience of farms, and also that enables new technologies to come to the fore. So I think, thinking forward 20 years, I'd like to think that government would learn to stick to things that work and not to endlessly chop and change policy, to learn the lessons of the past and then stick to it, because unless we all know if you're farming or regenerative farming, it can take 10 years before you start to see the results, so you've got to stick to things. That would be the first thing. And then I think I'd like to see this regenerative movement catch on, that farmers would discover that it gave them not only resilience for nature and for the health of their soils, but financial resilience as well. Lower inputs, fewer costs, more profitability as a result of that. And it then became a growing movement. And I'd like to think by the end of it, 20 years, the rest of the world would look at the UK and say, we should learn from what the UK's done. It's been on a bold mission, a move away from subsidizing land ownership towards payment for environmental delivery and ecosystem services, and it's been a success, and that they would want to come and learn from us. That's where I'd like us to be.
And it's a fantastic vision. What would the land look like if I looked at it of a train window? What would the food in the supermarket look like? What would food in people's kitchens and look like when they're eating at home? And what would the food we import look like? Would that have changed in a noticeable way?
Yes, I think it would be, if you looked out at the landscape, it would be more in tune with nature. It might look a bit messier in places. You wouldn't have those perfect arable fields with tram lines through them necessarily. But it would be more in tune with nature, and it would feel better. People would feel more comfortable, I think, with that type of farming. And then I think the health of the food in our shops would also improve. You would have a healthier food, and I hope as well the need for fewer imports, or at least if the rest of the world caught on with this as well, the consumers would demand a type of food that meant even when it was imported, it was still a wholesome food that was nutritious.
Justin, what does great look like?
Do I get to introduce you? It's a pain in the arse.
By all means. I was the guy who kept texting you at midnight with stupid ideas.
You were, in fact, a pain in the arse. Look, I mean, I think when you did your introduction, I was super pleased with where you ended, not where you started. Because you started with, there's a problem that we need to solve, and then you finished with but let's recognize that we got here because we solved a bunch of other problems. And I think you have to start by turning the whole problem on its head. We have the food system today as a result of a spectacular change on behalf of consumers in this country in terms of the quality of the food they eat, the safety, the literal safety of the food that they eat, the traceability of that food, the value for money that it affords, the nutritional value of that food in general terms. We forget rationing finished in my lifetime. I was born in 1961. Price controls in this country were only finally liberated for food in the late 1960s. In fact, there's still some food which is price controlled, but we could come back to later. So, a problem was solved. But mostly when you solve problems, you create new ones, right? It's a bit like the exercise in hitting the lump in the carpet. It pops up somewhere else. But I think if you start from that, it's much easier to chart what you do next, is the first thing I'd say. Second thing I'd say is, part of the reason that I was an irritant is I've had the great privilege in my working life of working in largely in retailers, and before that on the manufacturing supply side. And I've always had incredible access to data from consumers. And I think the consumer, the voter, when he was Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg once said to me, how come you know more about my voters than I do? And I said, because your voters are my consumers, and I have to get them to vote with their wallets every week. You just have to get them to vote once every, well, it used to be those days, 5 years or so. It's a bit changed since then. And so we have to be close to where they are. And this won't happen without consumers. And too much of the conversation about it is kind of in the abstract. There's an assumption that we can create something that then consumers will willingly embrace. So if you take that forward vision, the first thing for me in that forward vision is better informed consumers. Because I take the view that much of what we're discussing here today is just quality, right? Quality isn't just about the first thing that pops into our head. It's about any dimension of food beyond, the raw calorific value, if you like, that consumers are prepared to pay for. And consumers are mostly not driven by pence per gram. Most consumers, for most of their shopping, are not just trying to buy utility. Because, frankly, as we've said, we don't need to buy utility in our food anymore. We are, in aggregate, eating too much and exercising too little. So it starts with better informed consumers. That's the responsibility of government. It's the responsibility of retailers. It's the responsibility of everyone in this room. And as consumers become better informed, they will make different choices. And commercial businesses, be they retailers or producers, will be able to exploit those opportunities to better satisfy the things that are truly on consumers' minds. But I've been in conversations. I went to the 50th anniversary of the organic movement. David Cameron did a very powerful speech at it. Patrick Holman likewise. But the theme of the conference, I guess it was about 10, 12 years ago, given it was Cameron, was organic goes mainstream. At the time, it was 1.5% of the market, right? That's a deluded view of where you're starting from, in my view. And I don't think the sort of bill of goods that was sold, for some people, organic is the solution for the things they're concerned about. But we've got to move 50 million people, not 500,000 people, if we're going to make a difference.
So you talked there about the consumer. One of the things that you said that really stuck with me is if I put a label on the front, that's mostly it's about pleasure and flavor and then price and convenience. So quality, price and convenience. And quality can mean different things to different people. But for most people, it's pleasure and feeding their family, and that's what quality represents. And you said the only thing that shifts a dial on a label is a Union Jack. People may be prepared to spend a bit more for British food, but if it's environmental or all that stuff, it's noise. They've got very, very busy lives. They look at labels for 3 seconds or whatever it is. I argued in the food strategy that the fundamental economic underlying problem was that you have a system that has created refined wheat, oil, and sugar as the 3 cheapest sources of calories. That is then transformed into food, and you have the veg, but into food, and that you also have this problem with appetite, which our appetite makes us seek out junk foods that make us sick, and that it was an economic problem. And my problem with the consumer narrative is that when we talked to consumers for the food strategy, they don't want to have to work out what the best form of beef is reared or the best, regenerative farmers, some proudly, as I think is right, some irritably, don't have a definition of regen yet. So the idea of forcing somehow saying, well, the consumer's going to work this out when our rivers are filthy, when we're poisoning the atmosphere with carbon, when we're destroying wildlife at the rate we are, that doesn't seem to me, that seems to be a bit of a wishful, a Pollyanna-ish. You're putting too much optimism, I think, in the speed with which you can educate the consumer. And also, you two are so, you know this system. How can you possibly educate the consumer so they can drive this change?
Well, I think you do it progressively over time. I mean, if you look at what's driven growth in food sales in this country over the last, say, 20 years, by far the biggest driving force has been convenience, not price. I remember in my latter days at chief exec, everyone saying it's all about the discounters, and maybe you might think it still is. But the reality is, if you take a 25-year view, by far the biggest growth has not been discounters, it's not been the internet, home delivery, it's been convenience. Convenience stores, sometimes with Tesco and Sainsbury's name over the door, often with independent corner retailers. Convenience, by definition, is a premium price channel. Right? People are paying more. They know they can go and get it cheaper at an out-of-town supermarket, but they're paying for the convenience. Prepared food is the same thing. When you sell a ready meal for materially more than the sum total of the ingredients, you are selling time. You are selling time back to the consumer for the convenience of not preparing it for themselves. So all I'm saying is that you've got to think that there is only one form of currency for paying, maybe, but there is multiple currencies that you're selling under that general banner of quality. And the journey we will be on will be what we are able to monetize by virtue of the fact that consumers truly value it. And the biggest single thing that undermines us in that is making promises either A, we don't keep, or B, that aren't even true when we make them in the first place. I remember very, very clearly the nail in the coffin for us at Sainsbury's on organic meat was when Jamie, live on television, castrated a pig because of the growth cycle in organic farming. And our consumer went, oh, if that's what happens to the poor little things before we kill them, then I don't like organic. And we actually saw RSPCA freedom food meat accelerate rather than organic, because people felt it was a narrower definition of what they thought they were paying extra for. That not that the animals were not going to be killed, because clearly they were going to eat them, but that the treatment journey was better. And so we've got to be much tighter about the promises we make and express them in consumer terms. And as you say, and we're kind of all getting a free hit, I think, because at the moment people think the problem in our rivers is raw sewerage discharged by water companies. But I think most people in this room know there are lots of the industry that we are so proud of, the part that it plays in the state of our waterways. And that's, I hate to put it this way, but some of these dirty little secrets are going to come back and bite unless we get candid about them and truly address them.
So I'm going to come on to George about government intervention in a second and why that's so difficult. I just want to push you once more on this consumer point. So I agree with you that it is very difficult as the CEO of a supermarket to move fast to the consumer. You'll sell less, you'll lose profit, you'll get fired. But if the consumer isn't moving fast enough to solve our societal problems, are you supportive of the idea of the economic idea of the government putting the externalities into the system for you or regulating those problems because we can't as a society move fast enough? Would you be happy for the government gradually to put in a carbon tax or gradually to phase out, if the science was there, some forms of destructive pesticides, or to act much more strongly on water quality? Are you saying this is all going to be driven by the consumer, or are you just saying, as a supermarket CEO, that's all I can control?
No, and look, I loved being a supermarket CEO. It's a spectacular privilege, and I'd never, ever complained about my lot. It was an amazing time in my life. And I have never, ever hidden behind the idea that we as a retailer, I'm still a non-executive director at Marks and Spencer's, are led by consumers. It is our job to be ahead of consumers. We had a phrase at Sainsbury's, it's inelegant, but I hope it sort of captures the idea, which is that we should ask and answer to our customers' satisfaction the key questions before they even know they're the key questions that they need to ask. Because that's the bedrock of trust. When the consumer wakes up one day and discovers that the real issue is hidden pesticides in their food, or farming pollution of waterways, they discover that the retailer that they trust has known that for a long time and done a bunch of stuff about it, and the promise that they've been making to look after these issues. Because retailers are intermediaries, right? They're representatives of consumers in the supply chain. That's what they do. You have to be ahead. You can't be behind if you're going to be that intermediary. Now, from a government point of view, I'd say two things. I think the first thing, you often hear business people talk about certainty. I think that's rot. The idea that the government's job is to give competitive businesses certainty is a nonsense, because certainty doesn't provide any competitive opportunity. And I still believe competition moves the dial faster than any other force I know of. What businesses need from government is consistency. That's not quite the same thing, because the planning cycle of these things, the investment cycle of these things, as you know, in your businesses, is very long term. And if one policy lasts 3 years when it really needs to last 20 to really allow people to invest and make a difference with the returns that are available to them, then you're never going to get anywhere, because it's too dangerous to set off on a journey where the policy that it's based on may not exist by the time you get there. And the second thing I'd say, therefore, is always a focus on incent. Always a focus on incent. The first knee-jerk response, it seems to me, of the political establishment is always to ban, to tax, to somehow outlaw. And it's just a really negative force. The things that get people to put their risk capital, their time, their energy behind things is incentivization. Signal the way that you would like things to happen. Let risk capital chase it down, would be my plea to government.
And we'll come on to your brilliant idea about incentives, which I will share and get your thoughts on later on. I'm also, in about 10 minutes, going to turn it open to the room. You'll have lots of questions. I'll take them in threes. Do not make statements. If you make statements, there are actually hidden agents in the audience who will wrestle you to the floor and drag you out of the tent. We want questions to enlighten people. But before we go to you, George, government's really tough, right? Much harder than people think it is. I served under 4 prime ministers and 5 secretaries of state. You came in really having helped shape Elms, and then you were trying to land it, but we didn't get where we would have liked to have got to. Can you explain to these people why politicians fail them so often? Because I don't think... because I met a bunch of Labour MPs here earlier on. I went up to them and said, I just think I have so much admiration for anyone who wants to do that job. Can you explain why it is so difficult to say you're going to do something and then do it? Maybe take us through some war stories from your time trying to land Elms.
I think the first thing to say is my assessment's less bleak than you, Henry, about what we did, because we passed the Agriculture Act in 2020 eventually, a second attempt. We first tried it in 2018. A lot of the original policy thinking around environmental land management was done in 2016, 2017, and the scheme started to be developed in 2021 and 22. And we always said that because of the dependency that existed on the BPS, those direct payments, that we would phase this in gradually over 7 years, starting from 2021 and ending in 2028. And to be fair to DEFRA and my successors, and fair to me, but most importantly fair to the officials in DEFRA who kept this on the road, we pretty much delivered everything we said we were going to do in the agricultural transition plan that was published in 2018, 2019. So we did keep things going, but it isn't easy. And I think the clue is in the point you made, that you had 5 secretaries of state. Let me tell you that before you arrived, I had 5 secretaries of state before that. So that's 10 of us in total during a 15-year stint in government. And the trouble is we churn so much, and prime ministers always want to get the media plaudits for some reshuffle or other. They churn people so much and swap people around so much that nobody can get anything done. Because by the time you get into a department, it takes you probably 3 months to find the reins and work out what you want to do. If you want to do anything, you've got to do a consultation. It'll take the civil service probably 3 or 4 months to work out what should be in the consultation. They then run it for another 3 to 6 months. It can then take up to a year to process the responses to the consultation. Only then do they publish the next steps. Sometimes more consultation is needed. And all in this time, you will have lost ministers who had initiated the original consultations, and you'll have new ones in place sometimes who won't know what they're doing. Now, some of my successors maintained the trajectory, to be fair to them, on the agriculture policy. But in other areas like species reintroductions, just carelessly, thoughtlessly abandoned. A lot of the work that we were doing, quite creative thinking around animal welfare, all abandoned by my successors, sadly. So it's really, the pace of churn makes it difficult. That's the first thing. The second big problem is the Treasury. And if you're a department like DEFRA that needs financial resource to be able to incentivize farmers to do the right things, it's really quite problematic when you've got a bunch of typically 25-year-old swaggering economists in the Treasury who are really out to just pull the rug at every opportunity. And
why are the bastards spending our money? That's the
it's
Treasury.
It's always that, and they are. I mean, I'm going to sound quite unfair on the Treasury. I do respect the role and understand the role they've got, which is to try to manage public spending, because everybody comes to them wanting to spend more money. Very few people come to them with ideas to save money. I get that. But there is a sort of short-termism to them. It's all about how much can we save from this year's budget without a thought for 10 years' time or 20 years' time. It's very hard to get that long-term thinking. So the Treasury is a constant dysfunctional force generally within government, particularly on issues like DEFRA. And you then have the spending review process. You've just seen one done. To be fair, Steve Reed and the current DEFRA team, I think, have done quite a good job at generally securing that budget. And I know that they don't get many plaudits from the farming community over what happened on inheritance tax and so on. But on this one, I think they did quite well. So that budget's secure, but only...
They didn't know about inheritance tax. They were told the day before.
Oh, of course. The Treasury would have kept them in the dark. Yeah. Don't tell DEFRA. They'll come up with
so they thought they'd won a great result and then for the thing in the budget, and then they got told the night before about inheritance tax. So,
that is, that's quite normal. The Treasury do these things and then hide under the bed, and DEFRA ministers have to go out and face the music and take the flak for it. That's quite common. But when you have a spending review as well, that's 5 years, we know that to do the right things by the farmed environment, you've got to do things and stick at them for 10 years, 15 years. If you look at the experience of NEP, they stuck with that plan. Early on, they didn't get many results. You start to see a recovery in the soil biology after about 3 to 5 years. You start to see a recovery in farmland birds after about 10 to 12 years. We know that from what we've seen at places like NEP and also the RSPB's Hope Farm. So we know that you need to do the right things and stick to doing the right things. But it's very hard to do that when you've got constant ministerial churn and when you've got a short-termism in the Treasury. And then also, of course, you have government changes. We now have a new Labour government that needs to be able to say, change has arrived. We're going to do different things. We're going to do things differently, not like the last lot. And so trying to get them to adopt at least the principles of the environmental land management and the SFI. The analogy I use, it's a bit like trying to get a cow to adopt and take on a calf from another cow. It's to make it think like it's its own and to love it and nurture it rather than thinking this is somebody else's calf, I'm going to kick it in the face. And that's the problem you have with a new political party taking the reins. And of course, we can't change that. That's how our politics works. But you've got to try and make sure that they're invested in it. And I guess my one final reflection on this is the one consistency in our system of government is the civil service. And what I learned in the end is, despite all the frustrations and the fact that they always needed to do another consultation on things, if you could win an argument with them and actually get the DEFRA officials properly bought in intellectually to what you were trying to achieve, they would be the best custodians of what you were trying to achieve for years after you've left. And I see, even now, the government announce things that I know I initiated in 2021 that will have been presented to the new Labour government as a brand new idea that officials have come up with to answer something that was in their manifesto. But it really reflects the fact that they properly got invested in what we were trying to achieve. And I think that might be the saving grace for what I was trying to do with the SFI and the Future Farming Programme, is that the civil servants within DEFRA, I think, will try and keep it broadly on track even if they have to say everything the last lot did was rubbish and this is a new approach.
We might find out here from Steve Reed tomorrow. We might not. So I'm going to ask two more questions. One for you, George, and then one to both of you. You didn't talk about infighting and the problem with different departments. Do you want to talk about our experience with Liz Truss during the Australia trade deal? Have you gone on the record about that yet, or should I be indiscreet?
Well, I think I was pretty clearly on the record about the Australia trade deal in a debate in Parliament. Look, my view, I wasn't against doing trade deals with other countries, including Australia. They're a very important ally, and I think we could have done a trade deal. But a trade deal should be reciprocal. It should be that you offer access to your market in exchange for an equivalent benefit in the market of the country you're dealing with. And the problem that we had with the Department for Trade, and it was principally caused by Crawford Faulkner, who was a Kiwi, a New Zealander, who had come over to advise the government, is that you had a policy of unilateral disarmament that took hold, which was that we should just liberalise and expect nothing in return. Now, New Zealand adopts that as a strategy because it's a tiny country that's got nothing to offer in return anyway. So its trade strategy down the decades has been to go around basically saying, you can have free access here, please give us something. But for a major economy like the UK, that's not the way you do it. You behave more like the United States would, or more like the European Union would, and you demand something in return for the access you offer to your market. And it should have been possible, in my view, to have kept an envelope and a volume ceiling on the amount of beef that we were willing to allow imported from Australia and New Zealand. But I'm afraid the ideologues who said, they'd been reading Adam Smith at some point in their youth, let's just unilaterally disarm and give everything away for nothing, they prevailed in the end. Yeah. And that's why we ended up with this.
One of the Australian negotiators said, well, we were amazed by the UK approach. I mean, we did give up something, but it was a bit like the Swiss giving up their navy. And then, funny enough, one of the Telegraph, Robert Colville in the Telegraph wrote this piece at the time about how trade standards in Australia were actually better than our agricultural standards were better than our agricultural standards. And I used to work at the Telegraph. I wrote to him and said, Robert, why did you write this? And I sent him a list comparing the two trade standards. Who told you this? And why did you just put it in the paper? And he said, the press office at the Department for Trade told me it. So it was absolutely astonishing. It was not one of the most glorious moments in our governmental history.
It was difficult. And
I sent her a picture. I got in terrible trouble for sending her a picture of a mule's lamb, which is the practice of cutting all the flesh and off the back of a lamb to stop it getting fly strike. And in a fit of pique, I don't know if you ever got involved in that.
I got involved in lots of things. We had lots of arguments at the time, and it wasn't a surprise to me when Liz Truss became Prime Minister that I didn't remain in post for that reason. But I think the one thing we did secure in that trade agreement with New Zealand and in particular with Australia is essentially that the beef quota has to be hormone-free beef, and that does hamper Australia's ability to benefit from it. They will benefit from it more than they should. There should have been a cap of probably about 80,000 tonnes put in place, and an enduring TRQ, as we'd call it, but that wasn't to be. But we did the next best thing we could, having failed to get that.
Right, and one folk I can ask you too quick, because I know there'll be questions, but it came up a lot in questions that asked me beforehand, which is supermarket power and the margin of farmers. So George, you instigated the agricultural supply chain adjudicator. My view has always been slightly that if you look at the structure of the market, compared with the amount of corporatization in Europe, it's almost inevitable that the farmers don't have the power. They should cooperatize much, much more to get that power. Why did you introduce the agricultural supply chain adjudicator, and do you think it's working? But briefly, and then, Justin, is it a fair perception that the supermarkets are basically making farmers sell things to them at a loss, and the government, with its basic payments, was making up the difference?
We did introduce a supermarket adjudicator, but we found that wasn't sufficient because a lot of the abuses that happen occur with processors and middlemen in the market. And the adjudicator only applies to the 10 big supermarkets. And that's why in the Agriculture Act, we took an additional power, which was a power to regulate for fair contracting. And the thought that I had is the big dairy processors at the moment, if they come under pressure from supermarkets who are themselves in a competitive environment, rather than tell a supermarket buyer, we're not going to do that, we will not agree to what you're asking us to do, it's much easier for them to basically dump on the farmers that are supplying them and maintain the relationship with the supermarket. Now, if you create a contractual obligation on those dairy processors such that it's very difficult for them to dump on their farmers and they have to abide by the contract and the price or the price setting methodology they'd agreed to, you will make those dairy companies stand their ground properly and maintain the price that they need for their suppliers with the supermarkets. So we addressed it in a different way by bringing in additional regulations for those in the market. And this was important because part of the thinking in the Agriculture Act was, if we're going to fix this problem of poor profitability in agriculture, rather than say the answer is that the government should just give a subsidy to farmers to keep them propped up so they can keep producing food at an undervalue, we actually need a structural increase in farm gate prices. And that needed, in my view, to be somewhere between 5 and 10%. And the good thing is you can have a structural increase in farm gate prices of about 10% without a huge impact on retail prices of about 1 to 1.5%. And that's what we actually should be trying to do is get a structural increase in food prices, because unless we value food properly and enable farmers to make a profit for the food that they produce, we're never really going to get out of this vicious cycle.
Justin, 5 to 10% increase at farm gate prices? Is that the right answer? And if so, how do we do it?
Gosh, so look, it's not a conference to talk about grocery code adjudicator and the power of supermarkets, and probably on most of what George has just said, I just plead the fifth for now. I think I disagree with almost all of it in a reasonably profound way. Look, supermarkets, as I said earlier, are intermediaries. They sit at the join for the consumer, who for 150 years has been progressively, post-industrial revolution, detached from the ability to directly treat with the supplier of the goods and services that they buy, and retailers and brands came into existence in the mid to late Victorian era. It's why Sainsbury's was founded in 1869 as trusted intermediaries. It said over the door of the first Sainsbury's store, quality perfect, prices lower. It seems to me that 1869 is a very short leap to today, in a way. And the job of supermarkets is to sit on the consumer's side of the table. In very large part, the grocery code adjudicator has led to higher margins for very large processors and international brands at the expense of the consumer. That's a terribly bad outcome, in my view. And I think you should not be introducing, we have regulators and intermediaries in monopolistic situations. I chair OVO, an energy company. We have a regulator there. I think it's wrong to be trying to unveil yourself into that relationship with a goal of simply ensuring that the same good of the same quality provided by the same person gets more money paid for it. The way that farmers will get more for what they produce is by producing things that are on behalf of customers, things that they're highly motivated to do. What we did with our dairy development group in Sainsbury's, I don't carry a candle for Sainsbury's today, but we created a group of 330 dairy farmers. We guaranteed to pay a fixed premium over the market price for the extra goods that they did specifically for us in farming, which we believed we could sell, in inverted commas, to our consumer. We chose to sell it as a benefit at no cost to the consumer, because that is the nature of competition. It's very hard to charge more for milk than other supermarkets for reasons I imagine are obvious. But we were trying to differentiate our milk from other people's milk. When you come and buy it from Sainsbury's for the price that you would expect to pay in all other supermarkets, you get the benefit of a bunch of other things that we have secured through the Dairy Development Group. But we did that with a premium over market, not with a guaranteed price. And the biggest benefit that the 330 farmers in our Dairy Development Group got was actually the sharing of knowledge and information amongst themselves. Part of the challenge, I walked around here before I came into the tent, you're not short on advice, right? You're really not short on advice as far as I can see. But one of the challenges is, I used to say this to buyers actually in my retail life, which is you can assume you're the best buyer in the world, or you might want to assume you're the worst buyer in the world. The good news is if you do the latter, you'll seek to improve yourself. If you do the former, if you're a buyer, you'll fail and get fired. I think of it in the same way. I think one of the things that needs to radically change is, facilitated by supermarkets in good part, the sharing of information of how to do things better.
Great, thank you. Right, we're going to go to the floor. Do we have mics, or are they just going to yell? Got a mic. So we'll have one mic here. We've got a mic there, which could go to the woman with the blue hair. If it's not blue, I'm very sorry, but it looks blue in this light.
It's not only his hair not blue.
It's not blue. You're wearing a blue top and grey hair. Apologies. Do we have any other mics? Just two. Okay, so we'll take those. One question here.
Yes, hi. Henry, last year I asked you and Andy Cater a question about the rise of far-right politics.
Of what, sorry?
The rise of far-right politics in this country elsewhere. And in your response, you said it's going to be a fight in the years ahead from groups that are increasingly difficult to disregard. I suppose that's a sort of general observation that we have a fight. If I might press you more on a concrete example, and from this panel, actually, it'd be a mistake.
So what's the question? How does far-right politics...
Well, of how, as a farming community, how we respond, if we don't think it's in our society's health, how do we respond to the rise of far-right politics? Okay. And as leaders, I'd be delighted to hear concrete examples of what we
George
should
probably
or
had
could
the
be
best
doing.
answer to that, but I'll put that, and then the one at the back. And then can we bring that down to this gentleman here?
Could the supermarkets do more to improve our health, use their marketing skills? Could supermarkets do more to improve our health? And then a third question here.
John de Ramsey, I was the first chairman of the Environment Agency, and we've seemed to a certain extent, have been playing the blame game this afternoon. And that's played by everybody. In fact, you yourself talked about the fault of the rivers being in any way polluted was all the fault of the water companies. No, it wasn't.
No, I didn't say that. And I think that Justin also said that the farmers are getting a good ride at the moment because everyone thinks
the reason it happened was the Treasury, who you mentioned, refused to allow the 12 billion that we agreed with the water companies to be spent. They reduced it to 3. I had John Prescott's report, but not to the gentleman at the Chancellor, who was Mr. Brown. Anyway, the point of the blame game is, to me mentioning that, first of all, is to correct that bit of history. And secondly, in fact, not much word until the lady behind us has talked about obesity, perhaps some of our presenters could do.
My BMI is 29.5, so I'm just severely overweight, but not obese, I'll have you know. Thank you very much. What's your question? The question?
Why haven't we talked about linking health and obesity and the cost of our health? Okay.
So I'm going to take those two health questions together, and I'll come to far right. So there was a report today. It showed the cost of obesity, £126 billion to the economy. I mentioned Treasury. The government launched a mandatory reporting thing on Sunday. They said the supermarkets can nudge us into better health. Every supermarket attempt to nudge us into better health that I've seen has led to a loss in profits. That may not be the case now for various reasons. So, question to you, Justin, can we just let the supermarkets nudge us out of this 126 billion cost, or is there something else we can do?
Gosh, you're the master of asking loaded questions, aren't you? No, of course, I mean, look, of course you can't just let the supermarkets, but I think if you frame the question as, do supermarkets have a responsibility? Yes, they do. Could they do more? Of course they.
What's the limit of your ability to do that? Is what I'm saying. You see, no one's going to. If you just have fresh fruit and veg and no Kit Kats, they're all going to go to Tesco.
No, but it's not. Look. The beating heart, I believe, of great supermarket retailing should be informed choice. And the retailer is responsible for doing both of those things, editing the choice that's provided and providing the information necessary so that consumers can make the right choices for themselves. It should never be beyond supermarkets to take decisions that actually go beyond perhaps where consumers are today. As I said earlier, I think you have to lead. When we took the decision on fish, for example, for fish sustainability, that we would only sell fish that was rated green or amber by the Marine Stewardship Council, the first letter I got when we made that decision was from someone who I like to believe was a retired Sergeant Major from Tunbridge Wells, that said that it was an utterly ludicrous decision. We all know we were going to fish the seas to extinction, and that he wanted to eat skate until such time as it was extinct.
Justin did used to read every letter he got sent as CEO.
And I don't paraphrase that letter much, right? So you have to be prepared to take decisions. I don't think those decisions, on the whole, to your point, are limited by profitability, because profitability comes from competitive advantage. You know, what you're trying to do is to get people to spend slightly more of their very tight household budget with you on things that are more profitable, right? That's the whole idea. And almost all of the things that we're talking about, the agenda of sustainability, the agenda of animal stewardship, stewardship of the land, they are dimensions of quality that some consumers and increasingly more consumers are prepared to pay for, and there's margin in that. So, you know, just as I said earlier, the reason that supermarkets have been able to continue growing their top line over a journey of the last 40 years has fundamentally been convenience. If we are all indeed to start consuming much fewer calories. In fact, there's a 20-year decline in consuming calories in the UK, but that's perhaps another story. Not arguably, it's factually true. The nature of the calories has changed. You know, we've had this argument before, right? Let's have it again. But you know, a million people on Manjaro will make a small difference to those million people. But
30 million people on Manjaro will make a difference.
Maybe, but maybe we might have a bunch of other problems if that happens. But not least of which is completely unaffordable, right? But because it's £2,000 a year. I only know that because Henry's been checking out whether Manjaro would work for him, and it's.
I'm tempted just to see what it's like.
Yeah. Well, I'm 25.7. But, yeah. So I'm.
George, you don't look a beast either. I think you need to apologise for that.
I know. So of course there's more that they can do, but to the point of your Sunday announcement, one of my colleagues at the time, back in 20 years ago in Sainsbury's, texted me on Sunday morning and said, they've just announced they're about to do everything we did 20 years ago. You know, front of pack nutritional labelling was something Sainsbury's drove. When we did it, we were the pariahs of the industry for doing it. And you know, the informed and the powerful's view was you're simplifying a problem. It's patronising to your consumer. And actually, the consumer said, "Thanks, that's helpful. We can make slightly better choices, and that's what we'd like to do." So yes, of course, there's more you should do. I believe that the reason that so much of what we did at Sainsbury's was successful was actually because most of our competitors rode the other way, and that gave us a real point of difference that we were able to capitalise on in terms of growing our sales.
Justin's other brilliant idea, which was, he says, mischievous, but I'm now campaigning for, is to take a cut of the money. Most of the money on advertising food is spent on junk food. He says you take a cut of 5% of that, you give it to the best ad agencies in the land and tell them to advertise fruit and veg and foods that are good for you, and actually fight with the positive rather than restricting the negative. When it comes, we'll call it King's Law when it comes to practice. Right-wing politics, very briefly.
I will. Just briefly on this, though. I was working on an idea just before I left that you would basically introduce in law a kind of healthy eating objective that would be binding on certain food companies, but enable them to deliver that in different ways. So a bit like a responsibility deal, but underpinned by statute. And rather than having a ban on the advertising of so-called unhealthy foods, collect a levy from that and then use that money to do healthy advertising with things like Veg Power, that some of you will have seen, the Eat Them to Defeat Them campaigns, the run on a shoestring. If you could upscale the budget for that sort of healthy food advertising, I think it would make a big difference.
So both of you believe in that. It's fantastic.
Absolutely. Veg Power is a great campaign.
I saw a graph once, it's a few years out of date, and I don't know the source, so forgive me, but it was a plot of the year in which countries banned cigarette advertising plotted against the current level of smoking in those countries. And it was a completely inverse relationship. The ones that banned it first now have the most resilient residual smoking problem. And the hypothesis is that the advertising dollar in the countries where it was not banned early shifted towards low tar, low nicotine, and ultimately actually help people on the journey. So you've absolutely turned the advertising dollar.
I'm going to ask you to grab him about right-wing politics afterwards.
No, can I just make one point, not about right, but no. I personally think right-wing politics is the clearest indication that we have that our fellow citizens are fed up with the establishment, be it the establishment of politics represented by George, the establishment of business and the businesses that serve them represented by me. And the thing that we should read in that is that if we don't get ahead, as we've been talking about, then right-wing politics is what we're getting as our reward for our failure. That's the way I think about it.
I agree with that. I agree with that. You'd agree with that as well, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Okay, 3 more. We've got, where are the mics? 1 there, so we'll put the 1 there, and then we'll do, and then that mic there, once she's asked her questions, can go to this lady here. So we'll start over there.
Hi, Claire Ottridge, Grounded Research. I was just wondering what your thoughts were on putting more money towards advertising healthier diets when we've got the 5-a-day campaign, which is arguably the most well-known and the least effective advertising campaign for healthy eating and promotion of fruit and veg eating.
Thank you. Can we move that? So the answer, by the way, I think is an absolutely rapturous yes, but not just government money. Let's take hundreds of millions of pounds with a levy on unhealthy food and put it towards that. So I think we're all agreed this is a brilliant thing. Right, will you find someone there with that one, and then we'll come to Sarah here.
Thank you very much. Sarah Mukherjee, thanks, great discussion. Hi. What is your reaction to the current narrative that is gaining traction across the political divide, that the race to net zero is going to make us poorer, colder, and also hungrier?
Great question. And then to Lizzie here.
2 people in the room at the time, extended producer responsibility. What happened, and is that money could have gone or should be going back into food system change?
And then one question over here.
George Eustice said that one of the problems with government policy was churn. Now, churn of buyers in supermarkets is something every supplier knows to deal about. So is that the problem? The churn, the lack of knowledge, the lack of sympathy of the supermarkets and their buyers dealing with their suppliers?
Thank you. So we'll go, first of all, I think it's an interesting question, I don't know who wants to take it, on this narrative of climate change making us poorer, etc. Therefore, we should. What do you think about that?
During my time in DEFRA, and Zach Goldsmith was very keen on this as well, we tried to slightly recalibrate the environmental debate, so it wasn't just climate change, which can end up sounding very technocratic, and it's a divisive argument, but to make it much more about nature and wildlife. Because the truth is, people find it easier to connect to these things. So that's why we talked a lot about nature-based solutions, making sure that some of the climate investment went on nature projects. And I think that's what you've got to do to keep people with us. But my view is it was right to adjust the path to net zero, because I think too many bad policies have been locked in prematurely, and we closed off other new technologies like renewable fuels prematurely, and we needed them to be part of the mix. So it's right to recalibrate that. But we should still be aiming for net zero by 2050, in my view, because your farmers, look at the weather you've just had yet again for another year with extreme rainfall, extreme heat and drought. We need to take this seriously and address it, in my view.
Lizzie, I completely forgot your question because I was thinking about right-wing...
EPR.
Extended producer responsibility, sorry. Justin, you might have a view on that. And if not, I'm sure George will.
Oh, gosh. Churn of buyers, of course it happens. People have careers, they're trying to develop them. I think the kind of underlying idea behind it, which is that somehow it's a mechanism driven by retailers to deliberately destroy relationships with the supply chain, is just, it's not true. It doesn't happen that way. It's against the interest of the retailer to disrupt long-standing positive relationships. And it's against the interest of the consumer that the retailer represents to do that. But it is not against the consumer or the retailer's interest to negotiate hard on behalf of the consumer. And I'm not going to apologize for doing that. I've made a career out of doing it. On Sarah's point, old friend, hello. Look, I think it's the characterization in the question that you ask, right? Because it's a terrible sell. It's like, so we're all going to get excited about net zero, aren't we? But just before you all say yes, It's going to cost you more, it's going to do, and we didn't tell them a list of a bunch of negative things, at which point saying, well, no, I'm not going to say yes to that. Why would I say yes to it? And George just alluded to it. We need to think about, of course, there's a counterfactual, which most people accept, that if we don't do it, a lot of much worse, much more costly things, which will land in consumers' pockets. But we've got to stop protecting consumers from the journey. We've stopped increasing the tax on petrol and diesel for the best part of 10 years now. It's a nonsense. If you want to incent people to switch away from that to electric, you either subsidize electric or you get them to pay the real cost of actually filling their cars with fuel, and to the extent to which that's not enough, tax it so it's a disincentive so people might make the change. I mean, I just find the whole idea bizarre that you've got a government talking about the journey to net zero while not increasing the tax on petrol and diesel. It makes no sense to me at all. The inconsistency is huge. Look, extended producer responsibility is a kind of desire. The gentleman here talked about the blame game. It must be the retailer's fault. As I think most people in the room will know, most attempts to increase recycling in this country have faltered on massive inconsistency across the country in terms of what is recycled and how it's recycled. It's tremendously difficult for, what do I put on a piece of packaging when there are 90, roughly, different recycling regimes by council in the UK? You know, you end up saying vague things like may be recyclable. That's not wildly helpful. And in the end, if you're going to create a waste stream, that has to have a useful use. And one of the things that's done such damage to recycling is consumers discovering the stuff that they've been sorting out at their houses, diligently thinking that that was going somewhere useful. It turns out it's all still going to landfill somewhere in the developing world, and you feel like you've been misled. And back to our thing about politics, another example of you can't trust the people that are in charge. So we need to be much more thoughtful. Just creating a stream of recycled goods for which there is no demand, no economic use. What we tried to do under the idea in Sainsbury's was always send our waste stream to the most environmentally sound end game. So that started with food for human consumption, food for animal consumption, food then went by digestion. It never went to landfill, and so on. You have to try and solve the downstream supply chain problem before you just create supply for which there is no demand, at great cost and inconvenience to the consumer, by the way.
Thank you. Do you have
briefly on EPRs, I know we're short of time, but I don't think it'll change. I think it'll be neutral in terms of its impact on the food system, because it's designed, though, to drive the circular economy and to crucially do something different, which is to reduce the amount of packaging placed on the market in the first place. So it'll encourage the big food manufacturers to use less packaging if they can. And it's also designed partly by the Treasury to enable them to dump the cost of waste and recycling away from local authorities onto business. So the Treasury will take about £600 to £800 million off local government once they transfer the cost to business. And that was part of the understanding when it was introduced.
Thank you. So
governments love taxes that consumers either don't know they're paying or think are going to a good cause. That's why we're getting this. That's really why we're getting this.
Okay, so before I finish, I just wanted to say, before I thank George and Justin, one of the things that we're trying to do at Bramble is to create a voice. One of the things we've noticed with regenerative farming is there are so many of you here and it's fragmented. We want to create a coalition of 1 million hectares of regenerative farmers, and on that land, share data, do trials, create evidence, and also speak to government with one voice about ELMS and about how they do that, so that we are not just one of lots of different people speaking to the Secretary of State. We actually have a significant proportion of our land involved in one coalition, trying to find out how we can do this better and informing the government rather than having them inform us. If you'd like to be involved, there's an email on the QR code. Please do get in touch and we'll see if we can create a movement. In the meantime, I really would like to thank both Justin and George. Thank you very much for coming and standing here today. I'm sure you'll get mobbed as you go out with 1 million different questions, but thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, yeah.